One, one, two.
You're preserving it.
1, 2. Yeah, I like your mic better. Yeah. One, two, three, four.
Peace, peace. Thank you for being here at the SF, the first SF Hip Hop Festival. I hope you're having a good time because I'm going to keep doing that like all day till everybody is excited and hyped about it. Thank you for everybody who was with us for our first DJ panel that we had earlier. What a powerful panel. What a blessing we have to have all those legends, historians, story makers, leaders, innovators in the game of dancing. I'm a dancer, so I was really inspired. I learned a lot. I'm grateful for them. I wanted to get us all settled as we get ready for our next panel. So have a seat if you haven't had one. Come in if you're on the outside, come and join us. But we want to get started. We want to take advantage of these incredible legends and gentlemen's time. I am just here to introduce the panel. This is a talk, a new book by Rob Swift, and our host, our moderator, Davey D, legend himself. I'm not going to go too deep because he's got a long list. He's got a long credentials. So I'm going to just list off some things. Journalist, hip-hop historian, radio programmer, producer, DJ, media and community activist, founder of Hard Knock Radio, legendary Hard Knock Radio, one of the best radio stations programming in the game of hip-hop. Okay, I won't go too much longer, Davey. Also, he's the co-founder of the Bay Area Hip Hop Coalition, which was one of the first collective of radio DJs. Really important. I just wanted to acknowledge Davey and his importance to this culture and to this community and to the collective. Thank you. Welcome, Davey.
How's everybody doing? You all good? So today we have the honor of talking with legendary DJ, but also scientist and educator, because he uses the word scientist to describe practitioners in his book, The City of Hip Hop, New York City, the Bronx, and a Peace Meeting. I think the book is very, very important for a couple of reasons. One, it comes at a time when there's been a very deliberate attempt to erase a lot of our history. Not only is our history being erased by legislation that won't even allow you to teach it. For example, the book that me and Jeff Chang did was recently banned by the Department of the Department of Defense, right? The largest school district in the world, which the Department of Defense oversees, banned our book. And some people are like, well, that's a good idea, that's cool, it's a pledge and all that. Well, people are suing because of that, and I'll just say, while it may be a props, we're catching hell for it behind the scenes, right? So that's a real thing. Internally, there have been people who have tried to erase what is going on in our story, to relegate hip-hop to a particular date and time, with only one or two groups of people being practitioners or originators, and even using the word originators and who's first and who's second, I call that Columbusizing. And let me get to my next point. It was good to see everybody that was up here speaking earlier. There's a history, a robust history that goes back at least 40 years that was on the stage. And that's a very special history. But at the same time, there's other histories, multiple histories in this bay, right? So there's a dance culture that goes back to the 60s and 70s. And we've been in those panels. My man CJ Flash, who many people know as the DJ, early on was a dancer, parting that robot strutting and boogaloo movement that goes all the way back to the 50s or 60s. So there's a thing that we call the day before hip hop. And I bring this up to acknowledge a couple of things. And this is what makes Rob Swift's book so important. There are multiple scenes going on around the country at the same time that we were doing hip hop in New York. So I'm originally from the Bronx. I was involved with hip hop as a practitioner in '77 as an MC. I first got introduced to it in 1976. So that's how far back I go. I moved out here to the Bay Area in the early 80s, 81 to be exact. From a New York perspective, we're used to going everywhere and people being in awe, like, you're from New York. What's going on? What's happening? And having that, like, let me tell you what we're doing, and people soaking it up. The first time I seen people didn't care that you were from New York was when I went to Washington, D.C., where I played tennis players, so I would tour. And when I was down there, they were like, well, New York is cool, but we're Chocolate City. And they were just like, we're 90% black, and New York is cool, but we got our thing. And what they had at that time, and I didn't have words for it, they had an entire go-go scene. They weren't thinking about what was going on in the Bronx. Fast forward 3,000 miles away, I come out here to the Bay Area. And I'm like, I meet these folks from Oakland. I'm like, this is what we're doing in New York. And I'm letting them hear these tapes. And there was a guy named Rob from East Oakland. I'll never forget. He goes, oh, he's hearing these tapes of people rapping. And he's like, oh, that sounds like some pimp talk that I used to hear my uncles do. And what I realized is that people had their own movements, their own language, their own dance scene. And there's a point in time where what New York does integrates, and there are people that built off that integration and that introduction when Beat Street and all those things came out. But there was also an organic scene that exists primarily in a lot of black communities where people like, we're funk oriented, this is what we do. So while we had hundreds of crews in New York, they had hundreds of crews at the same time doing funk and having dance and having their own oral traditions. And so one of the things that I think is important as we get ready to have this conversation is to situate that scenario, because I think this is something that Rob Swift talks on. The second thing is that now you get to hear, and if you get the book read, what I think is really a New York Bronx story that brings to light why these movements, why a dance movement, why a percussion-based music movement, and all these other elements that we associate with hip-hop, why it emerged in the Bronx, why it might have had a different name and a different orientation elsewhere. So it's good to have you, Rob, and
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dave. Much love to everyone that decided to sit down and listen to me yap about hip-hop for the next hour, but it's an honor to be sitting next to Dave. I really look up to Dave as a journalist, as a historian, and whether or not Dave realizes it, he and I, we've been talking a lot for years, and he's given me a lot of ammo for the book as well, man. So a piece of you is in those pages, bro.
I appreciate it. Let's start off with the Genesis, which is the first chapter. And what I liked about it is how you situate, and you pretty explicitly say, these expressions have been in existence long before what we call hip-hop was around. So if there's a date, August 11th, 1973, you're right off the bat talking about there's a whole other thing that we have to take into account, kind of like what I did here, a day before of hip-hop. So talk a little bit about this Genesis, and then we'll start building from there.
I just feel that there's a lot of dogma that surrounds hip-hop history, and that dogma exists because a lot of our OGs, and I'm gonna be very blunt and honest with you guys, when they sit in front of a camera or a journalist, I feel as though their main goal is to exalt themselves. So they speak about hip hop in terms of what they did first. And I just feel that chapter 1 in the city of hip hop isn't necessarily downplaying the contributions of the OGs. It's more so, to your point earlier when you were speaking so eloquently, Dave, is more so asking why. Why were you the first, whether it was Grand Wizard Theodore, who we credit for being the DJ that decided to scratch records, coax a sound out of a turntable, a clunky machine that wasn't meant for you to scratch? Or what inspired you to take a spray can and use your city as your canvas? Why was it that youth like TBB, the Bronx Boys, and Spy from the Crazy Commanders crew, and Zulu Kings like Charlie Rock, why were they and their friends going over to a Crazy Eddie store? Totally dating myself right now, but Crazy Eddie was like a store that you would go to buy records, or a store like PC Richards where you would buy refrigerators for your kitchen. These youth, Bronx kids, would go to these stores, steal cardboard from the back of the store, walk it to a park, rip up the cardboard, tape it to cement, and use that cardboard as their dance floor. So I feel the OGs will sit down in front of a camera and say, I was the first to decide to use cardboard as a dance floor. I was the first to spray paint my city. I was the first to scratch. But my question, or our question, I wrote the book along with Rasul Moat. Our question is in chapter 1, Genesis, why were you the first? And the why is because these Bronx kids were marginalized. They were poor. There were projects, courtesy of our government, that were implemented. Benign neglect is what I'm referencing specifically. This is a memo that was written by Patrick Moynihan, who was the advisor to the then president in the late 60s, early 70s, Richard Nixon. He wrote a memo called Benign Neglect. And in that memo, he was basically advising his president that there was but so much that the government could do about the black plight. And the thing about the black plight is, in the Bronx, I'm sure you know this, Dave, because you live there, Latinos, specifically Puerto Ricans, lived alongside black people. And so in pathologizing black people, in this benign neglect memo, black people are drug users. They set fires to their buildings. The youth grows up in single-parent homes. And so in pathologizing black people, there was neglect. Police were defunded. Ambulance were defunded. Firemen, weren't putting out fires that weren't set by the youth. They were set by the landlords of these buildings. And these kids needed to express that frustration that I'm sure they felt. I wasn't from the Bronx. You can speak to this more.
Let me just jump in for a second. And I think if there's anything that you remember, I want you to, folks, to really understand the harm that this memo that was given to Richard Nixon came from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I often talk about the 4 horsemen of hip-hop who brought this apocalyptic condition. Patrick Moynihan was a liberal Democrat, so he wasn't in the same party as Nixon, but he brought this memo and he did several things. Some you mentioned in the book, which are entirely accurate, but I want to also expand that as well. He said, ignore militant blacks. That's what he said. Militant blacks, because they set fires and they're rioting. He's talking about from 67, 68, 69, the large amount of riots that were taking place throughout America around the civil rights and black liberation struggles, the assassinations that took place. And he pathologizes black folks, as you said. Then he says in the memo, pay close attention and bring resources and uplift Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, because they are more likely to assimilate. This is the divide and conquer thing. So we're living right next door to Puerto Ricans who have a movement that is going on, a militant movement under the Young Lords. But he's saying, basically, ignore these black folks and go to this other group and give them resources and take it away from black folks. Then he says, uplift this large group of middle class and working class blacks. They too are also likely to assimilate. So he's bringing a class divide. Why is that important? Because as these folks get recognized and resourced, you then have a phenomenon where we're growing up when hip hop is emerging of a group of people who look like me and saying, this is an embarrassment. We don't want you doing that. We don't want to put this on the radio, all this sort of stuff. And so this sort of thing is enhanced by Richard Nixon, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and they took away all the safety nets. So divide and conquer, class division, and defunding resources from communities that need it and giving it to other communities with the expectation and the push that they will be anti-black and also be willing to assimilate. That's that memo.
That was perfectly said. And the thing about it is, because of that memo, youth responded to it via tagging up their city, taking cardboard because they couldn't or didn't have the money, the funds to enter dance schools and dance in a proper studio. So they made makeshift dance studios in parks. This is why youth like Grand Wizard Theodore decided to reinvent the purpose of a turntable. This clunky machine that you play music on became an instrument for these kids to express themselves. Or MCs writing poetry about their environment. Listen to songs like The Message, and you'll understand what they grew up in. And so that's the why that we talk about in chapter 1.
You spend a lot of time also, as I mentioned, not situating the start of hip hop at one single date and not mythologizing it that way, but looking at, you describe it as multiple discovery. There's another term from a gentleman out here who's with the Oakland Maroons, Quadro Dutterville. He calls it diasporic call and response, meaning that all around the diaspora, throughout the Caribbean and the US, there's, people aren't, they don't know, but they're like, oh, I see these Jamaicans do that, I'm gonna do this, and then we pick up from each other and we kind of build. But talk about this multiple discovery, because it's not only geographical, but it's also generational as you go back into time before the 70s.
100%. All right, you guys familiar with Sammy Davis Jr., obviously, right? Regardless of age, Sammy Davis Jr. transcends age, culture, race. He's a worldwide phenomenon. Sammy Davis Jr. was a part of a group called the Will Manston Trio. It was his father, and I believe the third member was a brother-in-law or distant cousin. Anyways, the Will Manston Trio used to tour the vaudeville circuit and dance and sing. There's footage right now that you could view from YouTube of Sammy Davis Jr. doing a move that breakers, the panel that was up here before, would coin kickouts. Go on YouTube, just type in Will Manston Trio, Sammy Davis Jr., and you'll see him doing a move called kickouts. You could go on YouTube and do a search for a movie, a black and white film to be specific, called Wild Boys on the Road. And you'll see an actor by the name of Frankie Darrow performing a headspin in one of the scenes. So the point that I'm trying to make is that, again, if you circle back to what I was referencing regarding the OGs crediting themselves and talking about hip hop from their individualistic lens and not seeing the whole, And once you start to discover this footage of actors in movies performing head spins and tap dancers like Sammy Davis Jr. performing kickouts, or you could go as far back as the late 1940s. Again, go on YouTube, do a search for Northern Nigeria, Kaduna, and you'll see Africans performing a lot of the breaking moves, floats, hand spins, head spins, swipes, as far back as the 1940s. And if there's footage, archival footage, of Nigerians performing what we know now to be breaking, I think it's safe to say that the dance existed before that footage was even shot. So my point with that is that hip-hop, whether it's breaking, MCing, DJing, or graffiti, isn't something that I feel the OGs can say they created. They just redefined a form or forms of expression that already existed.
So I hope this is making sense, because this doesn't mean that any of these people saw these videos, because there was no YouTube and an opportunity to see it. But if you're looking from it from what culture does, so meaning that he describes in the book political, social, and economic conditions that exist all across not only New York, but in many parts of the country. There are ways in which people express themselves. Some people may express themselves by getting a drink and getting drunk and forgetting about their problems. Some people may get a joint, get high or LSD, and do drugs. That's a phenomenon. Other people will say, let me lose myself in cultural expression. This making sense to you? So what you have is like, people go, I will lose myself in the dance. And I think over the years you heard people say, even on this panel, man, I just lost myself in the dance. This is
Right.
healing. This is something that we do. But that is something, in DC they had go-go. Chicago they had house, right? Go to any place where you see people from the diaspora, from the Caribbean on down to the Americas, and you're going to see these various forms of expression.
Right.
They don't call it hip hop, and it might not look like hip hop, but they all come in these things, which comes down to the other thing. You talk about how these things were initially defined.
Right.
And
Right,
how,
right.
how hip hop would really come to be when you have these expressions forming like a Voltronic type of thing. So build on that.
Well, so hip hop, to your point, Dave, is the amalgamation of these four ingredients. Nowadays, we add the ingredient of knowledge, right? But the original ingredients are breaking, DJing, rapping, graffiti. But again, the point that we're trying to make in the book is that each element existed autonomously of each other before the 1970s. And when this generation of kids started to get noticed by the media, and news teams started to pull up into the Bronx, New York City, and document what was happening, I think these kids realized, kids like Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash, Kool Herc, they realized that they had something that they could package and sell back to the media, and that's when it became hip-hop.
You talk a lot in the book about the commodification. You alluded to that with hip-hop, but you also talk the commodification of race and how that plays a central part in both identity and the political structure of the Bronx.
Right.
Let's break that down.
So these kids, if you think about hip-hop, let's just harken back to that infamous flyer, the Kool Herc back to school flyer. When you really think about it, guys, hip-hop since 1973, August 11th, was something that they knew they could make money off. So if you read the flyer, Kool Herc charges 25 cents for ladies and 50 cents for the fellas. So they knew that there was money to be made, but I think the difference between what they were doing and the commodification of hip-hop in the early 80s, when the media discovered it, when Hollywood discovered it, is that Herc, Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash, Grand Wizard Theodore, the kids that were throwing these parties at rec centers and gymnasiums and in parks, they were the ones controlling the monetization of this culture. And by the early 80s, when they started selling their IP to record labels and Hollywood, they lost control. And then that's where the commodification of hip hop truly began. And the youth that started it lost control of it. And so now it's this industry that people in business suits in front of other rich people in business suits make decisions over. And the pioneers, the ones that started it, have no say. And so that is something that we definitely talk about in the book as well. Because as fun as it is to DJ and break and rap and write graph, unfortunately, we don't control how it's sold anymore and how it's distributed.
Or even how it's defined.
Or how it's defined, exactly. And for me, I think that's why the book is important, because again, it just brings a wider perspective on how we got here, 2025, and where it comes from. Never forget, it was poor kids that decided to do this thing that was actually nameless in the first 10 years of the culture growing.
One of the things you point out, and I don't know if that can be fully appreciated, is how young people are. Up on the previous panel, you heard people talk about we're 8, 10 years old, 11, 12
Right.
years old.
I started
right?
DJing when I was 12.
Right, so what does that mean when you're 12 years old? And this is an important thing, because now as we're in our 40s, 50s, and older, right, we're peers to each other, right? We can have a conversation even if we're 10 years apart in age. You can't have that conversation if you're 10 and I'm 20. You see what I'm saying? We have two totally different worldviews of things, and we're going to take in a whole other different set of values and understanding. And so if you're talking about a 13-year-old kid in the Bronx who is doing these things, which I think are brilliant, right? You got to remember that 13-year-old kid, which you point out, doesn't have language to say what I'm doing is I'm fighting oppression and I'm expressing myself in a way that's going to allow me to be uplifted.
Right.
You're just trying to have fun.
Exactly.
Right? We can look back at a lens and say what you did was brilliant, but with that, let's walk through somebody who's 13, 12 years old, who is trying to find themselves in a world that is that first of all is targeting them. So you have grown men that are targeting the youth by saying we're going to defund your school. I grew up in the 70s. We didn't have after-school programs, for example. We didn't have any, that benign neglect thing was real. We didn't have a prom in my high school. And I went to Bronx High School of Science, one of the best high schools around. We didn't have a whole lot of these things that we can take for granted. But at 15 or 16 or whatever, we don't necessarily know like why that's happening or what that means. I lived in a place where buildings were being burnt down all the time. We were told it was the gangs. We didn't know it was landlords until years later, right? So there's a lot of things that we don't have YouTube, none of that stuff. We just know what we're being sold at 12 or 13. So
Right. Well, I'll use myself as an example. I grew up the son of immigrant parents. My father immigrated to New York City. I know I don't look it, but my father is from Chocó, Colombia. And he immigrated to New York City in 1969. Then sent from my mom, not Colombian. Then sent from my mom and my older brother in 1971. They had me in 1972 in Queens. And so my dad, to make extra money, because and I'm sure this all applies now even, and I know people here can identify with the plight of an immigrant. You don't speak the language. You're trying to establish yourself in this foreign country. And I get choked up just talking about it. And what my dad did to make extra money, because we grew up super poor, 1-bedroom apartment in a tenement building in Jackson Heights, Queens. We had mice and roaches for roommates. I used to sleep on a cot, and my brother also slept on a cot. We slept in the living room, and my dad and my mom slept in their bedroom. And so to make extra money, my dad picked up DJing. He saved up the money that he made from a factory job, bought the best equipment he could afford, and started DJing in and around Queens. We would go as far as New Jersey to DJ parties. Well, not us, but my father, and we would help my dad transport the equipment. And then I'd sit there and watch my dad control a room of people without ever saying a word, just by the music that he played. And so for me, that was my first example of being resourceful, taking this creative talent to make money, you know? Thanks to my dad, my older brother would use his equipment to learn how to do what Theodore, Flash, Africa Bambaataa was doing on those mixtapes that he would get courtesy of his friends that lived in the town next to Jackson Heights, Queens, Corona, Queens, which was predominantly black. So a lot of the mixtapes from the Bronx would make their way to Queens, specifically Corona. My brother had a lot of friends in Corona, so he would get his hands on these mixtapes, study what Flash was doing, what Theodore was doing, what Bam was doing, what Herc was doing, and then on days off when my dad would go off to work, my mom would go with him, and we had days off from school. My brother would turn my dad's equipment and basically recreate what we would hear in this mixtape. So now I'm being exposed to not just making people dance the way my dad did, but using the turntable again as an instrument. And the thing there that I feel is super pertinent is that my brother, God bless him, thank God he's still alive, grew up with that gang mindset mentality that was afflicting kids in the 1970s. My brother's like about 7, 8 years older than me. And so whenever he was DJing, he was indoors, safe, not running the streets, not committing crimes. And so I saw that, and it was an influence on me to follow that path. And so DJing, the art of it, specifically because I'm a DJ, but really all the elements in this ironic way was created by these kids that were immersed in gang violence as a response, as an escape from that violence. And earlier, Dave, you were referencing the whole divide and conquer thing. Isn't it interesting that gangs decided or realized that us versus them equation was gonna either put them all in jail or 6 feet under. And so they turned to this culture that again was nameless as an escape from that. And I'm the product of that. And the kids on the cover of this book, you know, with this rubble behind them, those kids, Latinos, black kids, you could even sprinkle a few white kids in the Bronx, because before the 60s, the Bronx was actually predominantly Jewish, Polish, Irish,
and Italian.
And a lot of the white families that couldn't leave when white flight took place were stuck there, trapped there in the Bronx, along with the blacks and the Latinos that lived there.
Let's build on something, because I know we're running out of time, but I think it's important. In recent days, there's been people that have tried to demonize immigrants, in particular black immigrants, because in the Bronx it was a lot of Jamaicans, a lot of Haitians, people like yourself from Colombia.
Right.
And this is just my thing. There are people that I grew up with who, in the last 2 years, I'm just finding out that they were from the South. They never said anything when we grew up. My family's 4 or 5 generations deep in New York, right, on my mother's side. So they're New Yorkers. They've been here for a long time, into the 1800s. But a lot of folks were first and second generation. So, you know, Shah Rock will tell you that she's from North Carolina, and we know that, you know, Flowers was from North Carolina, and Disco King Mario was from North Carolina. So a lot of people were first and second generation from the South. But at the same time that they were moving to the Bronx, there were Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans, Haitians also moving. I always considered everybody who was moving there immigrants because nobody wanted to say where they were from. The Jamaican homies was like, man, I'm from the Bronx. The people from down south, they never claimed they was from the South, and I can wear that perspective of being out here. When I moved out here, people be quick to tell you, oh, my family's from New Orleans, son. You know, our family's from Texas. People were proud of that, but in New York, folks were like, you know, we from here. So you have a bunch of immigrant kids. Let's talk about the contributions. Was it immigrants mimicking people, or were there serious contributions that you could look at and say, all these people were bringing something to the table?
I think hip hop is this beautiful amorphous culture that has influences in other cultures. And I think it's wrong to say that hip hop is this centralized black experience. That's not to say that black youth are not the vanguards of hip hop culture. Of course they are. You can never deny that. That said, you don't have hip hop without the Latino influence, without the white influence. Think of songs like Trans Europe Express that was referenced in the panel earlier. They were Germans. You know what I mean? Songs like Wasp by Black Sabbath, they were from the UK. And so hip hop takes from a lot of different cultures and then redefines. And so as far as the 1970s, I'm not gonna, look, I'm 50, I know I don't look it. I look probably 18 of you guys. But I'm 53 years old. I was born in 1972, so by no means am I trying to like sit up here and pontificate and claim I was there at 1520 Cedric Avenue in 1973. I was 1 year old, right? But I did grow up with an older brother that was immersed with that first wave, that first generation of kids creating this nameless culture. And what I will say is that hip-hop is amorphous. It's not centralized. And its influence comes from everywhere. I like to say that, to answer your question, Dave, I think a better way to answer your question is, to me, hip-hop is like a puzzle. And if you guys are putting together a puzzle, you know that each piece of the puzzle has to be a different shape. It has to be a different color. And each piece in its differences has its own autonomous value. So maybe the majority of the puzzle might be a specific color, but if you start taking other pieces out of that puzzle, you may have a general picture of what the puzzle is, but you don't have the full puzzle. And so for me, hip hop is an amalgamation of different influences from different parts of the world, whether it's the Caribbean, whether it's places like Puerto Rico, whether it's the South of the United States, all congregating in this dense area that we call the Bronx, New York. And that's the thing. As far as the city of hip hop, New York City, the Bronx, and a peace meeting, we've referenced the Bronx because the Bronx is the petri dish where all of these influences were dipped into, and then over time, this thing that we call hip hop grew. Literally, like, you grow culture out of a petri dish. The Bronx was that petri dish, and the culture is what we're kind of like sitting in front of each other now for hip hop. You know, we're here to witness this concert later, right? I'm performing with Mr. Sinister, The Invisible Scratch Pickles, Mixmaster Mike, D Styles, Q-Bert. We got the Dog Pound, we got Diggable Planets, and all these other artists. But the reason we're here is because poor, marginalized kids in the Bronx, New York City responded to their condition in this positive way. And so, you know, as far as like the polarization that's taking place right now in hip hop and people trying to, you know, these factions, these acronym brigades, you guys know who I'm talking about, trying to divide the culture. It's just ironic because gang culture is what preceded hip hop. And the kids that were a part of these gangs wanted to bring the kids, the youth together. And so for the polarization to be taking place now, it's just ironic and sad, but I felt I needed to write this book to just bring my perspective because I've studied topics like sociology and political science, anthropology when I was in college. I just have a different way to see hip hop than the average OG that invented scratching or rapping or writing, you know, their name on a wall.
I think, how much time do we have left? Let's give it up for Rob Swift.
Word up.
So I guess we got one more thing that we can build on. I'm going to say this, so I can put on a little bit of a hat. I grew up in one of the places where some of those first parties were thrown. I heard of Disco King Mario before I heard of Kool Herc. So I'm in that section of the Bronx, the Soundview section. And right across the street is Soundview Projects. Not Soundview, but Bronxdale Projects, which is now called Sotomayor Houses. So the big park is where Mario first performed. And I bring that up because, again, if you come to my neighborhood at that time, you're talking at least 300 or 400 buildings in a 2-mile radius. There's no reason to ever leave that part of where I'm at. There's thousands and thousands of people. We got our own high school, Stevenson. We got project upon project with, 20 buildings, 30 buildings. There's no reason to leave. And so what is going on in that part of just the borough, you have no idea what is taking place in another part of the borough. Say you take a place like Co-op City, where it's one of the hugest developments in the country, right? Where they have their own scene. And that's just in the Bronx. We're not even talking about Brooklyn, which is twice as large as the Bronx. So we know that there's all these people at various times that are doing these expressions. DJing is in existence, as you pointed out, all around, right? People are doing some form of vocalization that we now call emceeing all around. People are doing dance all around. It's just, when does it all come together? And then we see it as hip-hop as it is today. Some of that is the commodification, but what I think is brilliant about this book is that giving room for people to have this multiple discoveries on their own and seeing that, well, I do this dance too, and this is a beautiful thing. The intentionality that you bring up, and then I'll ask you to answer this, is looking at the gangs who were very vicious. Many of them, they were divided along race, but you didn't know if a Puerto Rican was Puerto Rican because they could look like you or they could be light-skinned. But they might be in a gang like the Savage Skulls, et cetera, et cetera. But it was these gangs who had a political understanding, in particular the Ghetto Brothers, who said, let's have a peace treaty. And talk a little bit about that, because you say that's really a genesis that allows hip-hop to flourish in ways that, some of these other things that happened would not have been able to happen without the peace treaty.
Thank you so much for asking me that, Dave. That's why you're moderating this panel, dude. The book is called The City of Hip Hop, New York City, the Bronx, and a Peace Meeting. We put a peace meeting into the title for the reason Dave just laid out. In December of 1971, the warlord, a guy by the name of Cornell Benjamin, his nickname was Black Benji. He was the warlord for a gang called the Ghetto Brothers. And again, in the late 60s through the 1970s, gangs ran New York City because the police were defunded. New York City was suffering from a very severe fiscal crisis. So on top of there not being, ambulance services, fire trucks putting out fires, police were also defunded. And because of that, gang culture was able to just sprout. But the interesting thing about gang culture, it wasn't necessarily strictly violent or negative or toxic. Gangs policed their own neighborhoods. And so the warlord from the Ghetto Brothers, Black Benji, was sent by the president of the Ghetto Brothers, a Puerto Rican. The Ghetto Brothers were an integrated gang. A Puerto Rican by the name of Yellow Benji, Benjamin Melendez, rest in peace, sent Cornell Benjamin, Black Benji, to broker peace between two rival gangs. And at this site, he was murdered. When he was murdered, Yellow Benji decided to try to do something to quell tensions amongst all the gang members. Similar to the movie, raise your hand if you've seen the movie The Warriors.
In fact, that's what it's based on.
Right.
It's based upon that peace treaty.
So in that opening scene, first 10 minutes or so of the movie The Warriors, Cyrus, who's the head of the Gramercy Riffs, calls all the gangs in New York City and says, one gang can run this city. Can you dig it? And they all go crazy. That basically happened at the Hoe Avenue Peace Meeting at the Boys Club on Hoe Avenue in the Bronx in December, like about a week or so after Black Benji's death in 1971, December. So you guys are probably listening to me thinking, well, what does this peace meeting have to do with hip-hop culture and rapping and DJing and breaking and graffiti? The connection is it's not a coincidence that the consensus date for when hip-hop started is after a year or two after, well, 2 years after that peace meeting. And the connection there, just to get even deeper, is that before that peace meeting, you were not gonna bring out your stereo system to a park and throw a jam with gangs running wild in the Bronx, New York City. That was not happening because you were gonna get stuck up for your equipment. And the people that were there were gonna probably get stuck up for their jewelry. The Bronx was, and Dave could speak to this more than I can, but the Bronx was rough territory, to put it lightly. And so that peace meeting, in many ways, maybe not directly, but indirectly catalyzed the culture of being able to go from one block to another block and take in a park jam. And for a youth like my brother, my older brother, to go from Queens to the Bronx and take in a park jam, for a Fab Five Freddy to bring his white friends, his punk rock friends, white artists from the Lower East Side, Deborah Harry from Blondie, up to the Bronx and nothing happened to her. You see what I mean? So that peace meeting created a mindset, I guess is what I'm trying to say, amongst the youth that we could focus, we could channel our energy creatively and not hurt each other or hurt others that look different from us. And that's why you have these tenets of peace, unity, love, and having fun. They weren't just slogans. You know, these were tenets that were created to proliferate a mindset of togetherness, of peace amongst the different people that were now getting involved in this culture. So
let me just say something real quick, because I know we got to wrap up. Two things. One, the Ghetto Brothers are very influential because they were one of the largest gangs out there, them and the Black Spades. That's one thing to note. Two, they were doing block parties. The Ghetto Brothers had a group. They had a singing group. You can find their album. And after the peace treaty, they started doing block parties where they invited everybody to come. So I think that's important to note. So it opened it up. Two, the idea of peace is something that was floating around because in the backdrop you had Black Panthers and you had the Young Lords who were trying to politicize these gangs for a very long time. Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mom, comes out of that gang culture. Daruba bin Wahad, former Black Panther, comes out of that gang culture, and they'll talk to you about how they were trying to politicize people. They would have been the elders at that time. The Young Lords, Felipe Luciano, who is the original member of the Last Poets, will also tell you these attempts. And so the Ghetto Brothers took that up, and that's important. I'm going to close with this, because later on, other people start to really bring that piece to fruition in other ways. Bambaataa and Zulu Nation would be primary examples of that. But I remember going to the 40th anniversary of the Black Spades. And at the Black Spades were members of the Ghetto Brothers. Now, I was asked to pull the tape down because I filmed it. But what they talked about, first of all, they were talking to Bloods that were there. Because they were shocked that New York City, 40 years later, has Bloods in there. So they were like, what's this going on? But the Ghetto Brothers and the original Spades that were there talked about how they came together in unison to fight off the Hells Angels. And that was a pretty powerful speech to hear them talk about that. So to see that they were constantly talking about unity, and part of the reason these gangs happen and living in these communities, the Bronx was very, very segregated. So he could talk about the gangs that we had in the South Bronx, but when you went to the white areas, they had lots of gangs there too. And they patrolled their areas, and they were very clear. Black people can't go to Pelham Bay, can't go to Throgs Neck, can't go north of the Riga Avenue, can't go to these places. And so those gangs, at least in my neighborhood, the Spades was our protection for real. Like, man, you could live in your place, but once you went north, you were dealing with an equally brutal and just as large of a gang, except they were Italian or Irish. And that's something that we were contending with at that time. When we lived there, there was a thing they would call Kill Nigger Day that would happen all throughout the 70s. And so that meant that many of us either couldn't go to school or had to make sure we were protected. And it was those gangs that did that. In subsequent ways, they would come back and say, Kill Whitey Day, to go after those folks. But this was a reality that we were living with, and so it was never kumbaya without the intentional efforts of folks to say, let's politicize ourselves and create something that would be very different than what we were experiencing. So I think that's important to note as well.
That was dope.
Do we have to wrap up? Yeah, let's give it up for Rob Swift one time.
Thank you. Want to give it to Rob Swift. I mean, if you really think you know hip hop and then you go deep dive into this conversation and get deep dive into this book, now you know why.
Why?
You know why
exactly.
It started in the Bronx. Why people, again, this is just amazing. I know we could go into another hour of this,
of
2
course.
hours.
Thanks for having me, Alex, and thanks for hosting this.
This
Dave.
is amazing to have. We're going to actually transition. While we're transitioning to the DJ panel, Rob and Dave are still on this panel.
Yeah.
But we're going to open up questions right now. If anybody has any questions for Rob.